Hello, wonderful class. Thank you so much for attending this discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Indy Rishi Singh, and this is my link tree behind me. As you guys, some of you may know, or maybe you already use it. Linktree is a wonderful interface where you can share all the different things, any links or any recommendations or anything. As you can see here, I've shared articles that I've written that have been published in various places, interviews that have been done about me and the work I do, and also interviews I do because I have a podcast called Political Hope, which you could definitely tune into. There's 73 episodes, and it's a wide variety of people that I've interviewed and discussed things with, including things about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then if you want to go deeper, even deeper with me, I focus on neuroplasticity. I bring it into corporations. I work with organizations and community organizations, public ones, private ones. I go to schools and universities and talk about neuroplasticity as a form, learning about and practicing neuroplasticity, a form of resilience, a form of effective communication skills, and a way to connect better to maybe a more happier and healthier version of yourself. Particularly, this project is an application we're building, a well-being application we're building that's focused on supporting people to be happier and getting to health through being happier and engaging with that. But this, includes all the different things I've done, the different conferences I've spoken at, the different engagements, the ABC News thing, doing stuff with the police and bringing yoga and meditation to them, going to different schools and colleges and businesses and working with scientists and speaking about diversity when it comes to yoga and all the ways that yoga needs to be a little bit more diverse and more inclusive. And then beyond that, there's just a lot of stuff. So this conversation is going to be about diversity and equity and inclusion. And for me to, for me to start this conversation, I feel it's important for us to kind of discuss and articulate what does it even mean to be diverse? What is diversity in itself? Like, is it the skin? Her skin? Is it having a beard and a turban? Is it looking different than everybody? Is that diversity? What about diversity of philosophy? What if you have a different philosophy of how organizations should run, or how a different philosophy of ethics, right? Your ethics are different than the ethics of others. Like, what about diversity of thinking, or diversity of doing, or diversity of systems? And so as much as I've, sat in different conversations and participated in diversity conversations and equity conversations, and Black Lives Matters happened in 2020, there was a lot of conversations around they got supercharged. But, for me, it started way back, since I've been born, and especially after 2001, when people with turbans started getting attacked. And I'm not sure if you guys know, but, I can actually just pull it up here, attacks on Sikhs in America, right? And I just type that up and you'll see, oh, wow, there's like a timeline of attacks against Sikhs in America, okay? This is like a really big issue. There's a lot of, Sikh people with turbans get attacked a lot because we get called a terrorist around the world because the media depictions of terrorists always shows them with turbans. The opposite is so true, though. Sikhs are some of the most peaceful, loving, giving people in the world, yet we get attacked because of the portrayal of how the media shows up, and also a lack of education in the community about what are Sikhs, what are these different philosophies and ethics. Why do we wear turbans? Why is that not discussed or shared? Why is that not more public access and public knowledge, especially if we're in the public and in the community? So that being said, I got to give you my perspective, especially coming from a Sikh family, coming to America, being immigrants, and then being ostracized and discriminated against, and including myself. I must say, when I was 10 years old, I remember a teacher of mine, talk about authority. A teacher of mine was incredibly racist and just did something really terrible to me. And when I went to the principal took the teacher's side. And I had a really terrible moment of experiencing authority, systemic authority, systemic discrimination with authority. And that's been a prevailing theme throughout my life in different industries and different companies in different varying ways. And so it comes to this conversation now. And I'm going to pop up something, a visual. And I would love for you to, just take a look at this visual. it's a little bit different. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and one of the things I notice is, it can easily become very performative, right? Like we know that diversity can be performative. It can be a performance allyship. Obviously, I'm sure during the past few years, you've seen how people like change their posts, or they post a black box, or they post a whatever box, or they post something, or they put something on their like profile saying that they're that performing some sort of ethics, performing morality, when performing allyship. But really, we have to start questioning, like, what's the difference between performing it and actuating it? And I think before we can go anywhere, we have to really look at this within ourselves. It starts within. What's the difference between performing your sense of care and doing a sense of care? I mean, there's a fine line between those two things. How do we participate in the world like that? And then from that place, once we determine who and what and where we are on that space, are we performing or are we doing it? Are we caring or are we performing to care? When we can delineate that process and we can really understand and be and saturate ourselves in compassion and care and inclusivity, true inclusivity, then we also start to kind of have to break down our judgments of other people. And we're constantly putting people in a box. We can't help it, right? Like our brain is designed to create patterns. So we want to put this person in a box, this person wearing a turban. Oh my God, what are they doing? I don't understand the turban. So maybe they're a terrorist because I've seen it somewhere else. They're a terrorist, right? Or maybe I read about these, right-wing people being crazy and they're against this and this. And so I'm not going to like anybody who's right-winged or left-winged or blue or red or whatever the heck it is. But we create these categorizations that prevent us from asking questions, from being curious, from having the courage to ask questions, because that's a big part too, right? So it's really important when we start to contemplate DEI, we also need to start understanding how we judge others, because people are judging us, but it starts within. If we judge others with more openness and more curiosity and more courage to be curious, it also then might bring about bridges to create more DEI, to produce more of that, for us to saturate in that. And I guess another way for me to share, this idea of preventing a performance of DEI is starting to also contemplate the 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 richness in nature, right? Nature has to be diverse. Like we can't get around that. I mean, is nature diverse? Why is nature diverse? That's probably good. Like why is Earth so biologically diversity? Diversity are solutions in nature. Okay, I'm going down this thing, right? And you can see diversity in nature is incredibly important. It creates resilience. Actually, in nature, it's crazy if there's a parasite or a fungus or a bacteria, a virus, whatever in nature, like with like plants and crops and animals, and like in just like in a space where there's no humans, what happens is there's complementary plants and there's complementary animals that actually end up protecting the whole space. So the diversity of the ecosystem protects it from falling apart. So when there is a toxic element, there's the diversity is actually what supports. Okay, so that's crazy, right? So think about that within organizations, your community, your workplace, when you end up wherever you end up working, wherever you end up going from here. How can diversity create resilience? How can diversity, not just of skin color and ethnicity and culture, but maybe also ethics, morality, background, spirituality, how people think about how they show up in the world, how they're of service, the diversity of all of those things, how that diversity of work ethic, right? I mean, then we can get in archetypal stuff and having diversity in archetypes, right? Which I'll talk about in a moment. But let's go back here. I'm going to introduce something to you guys. I have to, thank over here Reinventing Organizations. This is a terrific a book and concept that has been developed over quite some time by a whole bunch of people. But Frederic Laloux is, quintessential in getting this started. But it's something that's been, prevalent for a while. And you can see here's a really cool diagram as well. And I'll dive into this in a little bit. But this is where I want you to kind of put your attention to. Right. And through the middle, you'll see kind of like the examples of these systems. Right. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's talk about systems. Let's talk about how systems are what are kind of perpetuating either the discrimination or the supremacy, right? And forget about what kind of supremacy and what kind of discrimination, but like how systems perpetuate it, right? Let's get away from the individual, because a lot of times we hyper focus on the individual, and we'll get rid of an individual, but the system doesn't stay the same, right? And it's like, we're like, wait, what's going on? Nothing is changing, or it's not changing fast enough, especially with the way people are suffering right now, economically, health wise, education wise. There's a lot more. The balance is tipping towards harm, right? So how do we create systems that create harmony? And really, we have to look at this concept map right here. I love images, and I love, design, right? Infographics. I don't know how you guys are about infographics, but here's a great example. So we have at the bottom, take a look. What's at the bottom? What's in this red circle? We call these red organizations, right? And let's not get too attached to the colors, but maybe the colors represent something. I mean, how do colors make us feel? Think about that's kind of interesting. Even with branding, right? You'll notice colors make a big difference. There's companies that don't let go of their color, right? Coca-Cola uses red, right? Like all these different organizations use red, right? What are they denoting? What are they asking for, right? What kind of thing are they suggesting in that red color or yellow color or orange or whatever it is? But let's start with this red circle. Actually, and what I'll do is I'll zoom in over here so we can look even closer at it. Okay, so right here, we've got a situation where we've got these red organizations, and they are able to sustain themselves by using fear and chaos and command and authority, and there's a division of labor. You can see this a lot with gangs and the mafia, tribal militias, but you just see this in any organization where there's they use power and fear to command authority, right? And you could see this kind of being used not all the time, but in some organizations and some communities, even some cities and governments, right? You can see them start to do this, right? And you can then eventually see it in an authoritarian or dictatorship. You'll see this like on full blast, right? But you can get trickles of it, right? Even in our democracy, you'll see this happening where fear is being used to perpetuate authority, right? Okay, so we'll go from there. Okay, now let's go to a little bit of the next organizational system, right? Is this yellowish organization, right? Which is more hierarchical. It's like their school systems, our churches, our governments, right? Where there's like a vertical hierarchy, right? Like there's people at the top, there's a priest, there's a president, there's a principal, there's whatever that's deciding everything ultimately. There's formal roles, there's, long-term, there's a lot of control, but there's stability too. Okay, so, that's why it lasts a little bit longer. Okay, and then you got your competitive profit-driven organizations, right? Your public universities, maybe you're at one right now, right? You have a large corporations, kind of like the same system, right? They really espouse meritocracy and accountability, and they want to encourage innovation and competition. I mean, ideally, right? You can clearly see that some of these organizations, though, these larger corporations, they start to move towards this, right? Some of them do that, right? And some universities start to do this, and you could see them kind of moving towards this, right? Anyways, just might be worth taking a look. And then we got these green organizations, right? Ben & Jerry's is a good one, right? They're very agile organizations. They tend to, focus on, engagement, shared values, and they care about culture over strategy and empowerment and stakeholder balance, right? So they're not focused on the shareholders as much as they're focused on stakeholders. Really it's about, they really care about culture, right? That's really more important. Whereas these other ones are a little bit more control oriented or maybe profit oriented. This now is starting to become about culture. And then we get to our teal organizations. And this is where we're talking about reinventing organization. We're talking about DEI. Like maybe this is where we can be moving all of our organizations and systems towards in their own unique way, right? There's not one pill, right, that is a solution. But what if we are moving towards a distributed decision making, more decentralized, right? Maybe a more anti-fragile organization that if something happens like a pandemic, there's adjustment that can happen, like the organization can adjust. What's the higher purpose? What's the evolutionary purpose? Self-management, right? Like when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how much are we allowing people to manage themselves? and be inspired and motivated to do something, not because they're told to do it, but because they see the vision and they're participating in the collective vision. And they feel whole. They feel good coming to work. They feel good coming to the organization. They feel good participating in it. They feel good. They feel safe. And that's a teal organization. So, I just gave you guys this breakdown, but, here is like another way kind of looking at this, right? These reinventing our organizations based on these colors and starting from an impulsive place to being a little bit more conformist, to being achievement based, to being pluralistic, and to being evolutionary, right? And there's a way that we can kind of move this to it, even with this X and Y axis. We're seeing the different varying aspects based on where we are in this circle. And this is like an amazing map. There's a lot to dive into this, and I probably won't bore you with all of this, but I will come back to a point that I was making earlier, that our decision to our decision to be in a community organization really is based on our discernment, right? Our discernment of what kind of system do we want to participate in. And if we want to be in a place where diversity, equity, and inclusion is robust, is rippling, right? Not just with the people who are present in the organization or community, but it's rippling out towards the outer community, whatever that is, right? It's rippling out. Maybe it's rippling out in the product that's being created and offered. Maybe it's rippling out in the academia that's being produced, or the research that's being produced, or maybe it's the content that's being created is rippling out. But the point is that if the culture itself, if the culture of the organization, the culture of the community is practicing diversity of ideas, diversity of being, diversity of philosophy, not just diversity of ethnicity or culture, but even further than that, diversity in many different ways. What that's also going to do is it's going to reflect the outer community automatically, right? Because it's going to be like, okay, if within the organization there is that kind of ethics, it's going to attract that kind of ethics outside. So even your customer level, the level of your customers, the level of your content absorbers, right, will also upgrade, I would say, right? Evolve is a word that was being used with, this concept map right here. If the culture within the organization is practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is going to have incredible transformative effects beyond the organization. And then more importantly than anything else, it's also about understanding how ownership works, how power works, right? Power is a big part of this, right? If we actually think about it, look at this, right? Like when we think about these organizations, the DEI, notice how the bottom is super hierarchical, right? I'll go over here and if I type in teal organization and I go down here and you see Patagonia, hey, that's a teal organization. Hey, you guys heard of Patagonia, I'm sure, right? And so we go down here and we go to holocracy, and sociocracy, right? These are really important ideas to start to read about and study, because we're learning right now that whatever the systems we're in, right, these vertical hierarchies where there's a CEO, a principal, a boss, something at the top, that it's really easy for them. Maybe once in a while you get a really good person who really understands the people and really takes care of everyone once in a while, but the majority of the time they're out of touch. They might be practicing stuff that is abusive or harmful to people, or maybe they have biases, and those biases, and maybe they're implicit biases, right? But they're affecting the people throughout the organization, or maybe even a minority of the people they're affecting, but it doesn't matter. There's ripple effects of that, right? But that can happen if there's one person at the top and they have that much influence, right? Or maybe a board, what's it called? There's like a board, there's a board membership, right? They also, like, if there's like just a few people at the top that are deciding everything, what if, like in the situation we're having now all across the world, and especially in America, what if they're out of touch? Like, what if they're living in their mansion, they're super wealthy and then like they have students that are like a college, for example, right? You have the people at the top who are making decisions, but they are not in relationship with people who are struggling to pay for college. So they're not going to have much empathy or understanding of how to support that, right? Like they're not going to even have any urgency to support that. Meanwhile, something like a sociocracy, something where there's a horizontal organization, and I can write that in, horizontal organization, right? If there's a horizontal organization, actually, then what happens is the organization is actually split throughout the organization rather than a hierarchy at the top, right? There's a little bit more diversity when it comes to, you see holistic management over here. What starts to happen with the horizontal hierarchy is that it's a little bit more decentralized. A good example of cooperative businesses, right? Where and cooperative housing and cooperative whatever, where ownership is shared throughout a bunch of different people or a bunch of different pockets of people, right? And then they self-manage each other, and then they can come back together once in a while. But there's billion-dollar companies in the world that are like that, right? Where there's, it's not, the decision making is being done across the organization rather than from the top down, right? And I think that's something that we have to think about when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that if anybody is at the top, and it's just going to increase the probability of their bias affecting people throughout the company and beyond the company, beyond the organization, right? It's like, it's inevitable, right? Even if especially if it's a nonprofit, right? Once again, great thing to think about. Some of these nonprofits out there that are working with houseless folks, or nonprofits that are working with children, or whatever it is, right? How many of the CEOs of those organizations are suffering or continue to suffer from the things that they're addressing? And so if they're not going to be suffering, if some of them are making $1 million a year for their nonprofit, are they really going to understand what kind of urgent decisions need to be made to support the equity of the community, to support the equity of what they're solving, right? So this is where we need to start really, I guess, being a little bit more courageous about questioning out the systems that we operate in, and maybe building new systems that are more holocratic, that are more sociocratic, that are more holistic, creating more management that's more holistic, right? Like, we need to create that if it's not there. But it is there. Like I said, if I scroll up here, you can see here's a bunch of organizations that are literally doing it, right? Boom, 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 right? I mean, notice how some of them are in Europe, right? Because Europe actually supports holocratic, cooperative businesses. There's a lot of support they give. And it's starting to happen in America. In California, recently, there was a bill that was passed. What is it called? When both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, when they both support it, right? So they both supported a bill that would pay companies to switch to employee ownership, right? Which is like switching from like owned by like shareholders and a CEO to being owned by a company owned by its employees. So like, there we go. There's a sociocratic switch, right? That the government, our American government, is actually supporting. So that's something to think about, that, hey, like, actually, there are ways that we need to move towards that are going to create more democracy in the workplace and democracy in our communities. And that's really what this is all about. This conversation, we talk about DEI and we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can't talk about that without talking about democracy. And are we practicing democracy in our schools? Are we practicing democracy with the decisions that are made, like where the money is spent, what is going to be built, what do the students need, what do the teachers need, is that democratic? Is that process, that decision making, democratic? Like, we really have to question these things. Is the companies that we work in, are they democratic? So if they're not democratic, if our universities are not democratic, if the companies we work in are not democratic, if the way that we support for artists is not democratic, right? Then how then are we in a democratic country? Like, how democratic is our country if all the systems within that democracy are not democratic? I'm curious, like, how is that even possible? Like, I'll ask you again, how can our country be democratic if the organizations, the companies, the universities, the colleges are not democratic? Like, so the private and public industry, right? Like, even a public industry, even people going to work in the public industry, if they're going to be lawmakers, they're going to work in city staff, city, county, state staff. If everything around them is not democratic, how can they show up in a democratic way? It's literally like they're swimming in undemocraticness, and then they're like, how they won't even be able to do it. So uh I bring all of this around to all of you just to, come back to this image and to this concept. and to explore, where do you want to go? What kind of community do you want to cultivate? What kind of organization do you want to cultivate? No matter where you end up working, whether you create the actual system or you join an existing system, there can always be evolution. Nothing is ever fixed. But the question that needs to be asked more and more is, how democratic is the place that I live in, the place that I operate in? And then how can it be more democratic? How can it be more sociocratic, right? Maybe we need to study that more. What is sociocracy, right? How does that work? I mean, obviously, it's like it's something thinking about that's also relevant to our current technology systems. Like, how can actually we use technology to be more sociocratic? How can we be more like nature? Where the diversity and the equity and the inclusion is already present. You go into any lush ecosystem, a rainforest, a forest, you go anywhere, there's incredible diversity and it's all supporting each other. How can we cultivate those places wherever we work, wherever we live, wherever we learn, wherever we feel intended to be? How can we create that diversity there? And really, it's not just about for us, because we're human, it's a little bit different for us. We need to be a little bit more diverse and inclusive for different ideas of economics. We need to be more diverse and inclusive for different ideas of ethics. We need to be more diverse and inclusive about different ideas of work, like how to work, like work ethic. Diversity and inclusive of different inventing styles and inventiveness and resourcefulness, right? So I think it seems apparent that we need to become parents of a more democratic world. And we're all being called, especially you, where you're at right now. The hope is that within you. I'm going to come back to my podcast over here. So the hope is within all of you, right? And how you learn and study about how to create more democratic, sociocratic, holocratic spaces. That is the transition for our world to become more like that and to represent and show up more with nature, to be more proactive about the challenges and the issues that we face in the world by actually embodying the solution in our organizations, in our communities, in our schools, like all the different places. If we're biomimicking nature and we're showing up like nature does, then we're also going to be able to show up for nature even better. And then the climate issues that we're facing can reverse. I mean, keep in mind, you could do your own research. You could listen to my podcast. We can reverse a lot of the problems that we have in the world, but we need to create more horizontal organizations that prevent a person at the top or a group of people at the top to turn down great ideas, right? Ideas that would advance human civilization and also help us advance with nature, with respect to nature. In order to do those like bold things, those urgent things, we kind of need to move away from one person deciding what's going to happen, because they're just going to keep preventing that because they have their incentive models to stay in power, just have everything stay the same. So you can see how the incentive model for having people at the top, an organizational structure where there's somebody or a couple of people at the top, how that is completely and it's the antithesis of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's literally the opposite of it. If there's ever anybody at the top, there's always going to push towards an imbalance of equity, an imbalance of diversity, and an imbalance of inclusion, just by the very nature of it. You know, you can't have the tip of a pyramid, and the tip of the pyramid doesn't know what the bottom of the pyramid is about, right? Like, that has no idea what's going on there. It's impossible. That's an impossibility. They're never, unless they fall down to the bottom of the pyramid, which doesn't happen very much. And if that does, most often than not, because the systems are all rigged, then when they do fall to the bottom, they don't actually fall to the bottom. We end up paying for them to go back up. You can see what happened in economic crisis in 2008. You can see what's happening over and over again, where people make these very, very wealthy people make terrible mistakes and they get more money from the taxpayers. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It's like a pattern that's happening because our systems are not democratic. So the invitation is for you with this DEI project is to continue exploring what it means to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into the systems that exist around you, how not to be performative, right? And how to actually show up in a way where you're creating spaces that are more, there's more horizontal hierarchy, there's more communication, better communication, there's more understanding and tolerance of different ideas around economics, ethics, beingness, right? Different cultural philosophies that are being able to be mixed and integrated with each other. And then just like a forest or a rainforest, we can all flourish together. We can actually expand together. We can do some incredible things in the world. And this world can become a place, a paradise for all of us. But it will require some significant systemic changes. The good part about it is there's organizations that we can look to, right? And we can embody those cultures. We can do that. We can study them. We can understand them. We can read books where we can learn more, right? Just like this one, we can read more about books and listen to podcasts and do things where we can understand a little bit better how to be more how to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion ourselves. It's the most important thing. So thank you so much for tuning in to this presentation. I hope it was interesting, and I'll leave you guys with a little bit of flute. What do you guys think, huh? Should I leave with a little bit of flute? You guys like the flute? Something nice? All right, hold on. All right, let's see. What we got? Thanks, guys.